Buenos días a todos y bienvenidos otro miércoles más a las charlas de ciencia compartida. Hoy tendremos como ponente a Eric Dawson, un experto en el campo del petróleo de 25 años, ya tiene experiencia, la verdad, y viene hoy aquí a hablarnos sobre el caso de las prospecciones de petróleo en todo el mundo, y también nos hablará en especial del caso de Canarias y comparando los beneficios y los riesgos que tendremos aquí y con el cambio climático. Ahora dejaré a Mario, una amiga, que hable un poquito más en profundidad sobre Eric y lo que ha hecho.
Gracias. It's good to be back. That's because we have good memories of ocean conservation, and that's also a connection that we have with Eric. We met Eric because Eric is like us, really into sailing and into cruising, has traveled a lot. And in his profession, we've come to know him as an expert, one of the few, I think, that has a general overview of what is going on in the oil industry. And he also has the talent to talk about that and to bring the general message, what's going on in the oil. I've known him as a very good friend as well, in Cruising Association, and someone who is very aware about the industry that he works in. And in that, he's working now in changing the industry from within to bring more awareness in the oil industry about what is going on generally in the world and how that affects the production process. He does that through an own organization called Aberdeen Climate Action that he started this year. And I must say very fervently, because always also together we exchange ideas about everything about climate that affects the oceans as well. So please, I give the stage to Eric, who's going to get you to your chairs for the next couple of hours, I'm sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming here. And before I start with the real part of the talk, I want to make sure that we have an understanding about some things which have to do with people like you and me, and economists and politicians. And we don't always speak the same language. What you see on this slide is a few trees. It's a forest. It's the old wood of Rum, which is about 5 miles from my house. And it's where I come to walk, and it's where I take my son, and he plays around. And that forest was a forest when my father was a child. In fact, it was a forest when his grandfather was the age of my son now. And that, to me, has value. That forest has value. For an economist, the forest has no value. Because for an economist, what has value can be expressed in money. And these trees, they are there now, but they were almost as big 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So there's no change. For an economist to turn this forest into value, I would need a chainsaw, and I chop down the tree, and then I can sell it as firewood. That is value. So then for one day, I will have 300 euros of GDP, what do you call it, PIB, I think. And I will have growth, because I will have 300 euros more than I had yesterday. And then the next day, I don't have a tree to chop down, so I have a recession. And then after that, so at the end of the week, everything will be just like it was before, for the economist. For me, it won't be, because I had a forest and I don't have a forest anymore. You have to have that understanding that GDP measures only things in money, and it only measures the transfer of money. So if I buy something from another country and I sell it on to another country, then I add a lot of GDP if I buy something that's really expensive. That doesn't mean that I have any money left. It doesn't mean that my country has any money left. It just means that there's a lot of money that passes through my hands. That's a very important understanding to have, because a lot of the discussion and a lot of the numbers that go around have to do with GDP or cost or values. This is the outline of my talk. There's 3 sections. I will start with petroleum development, the project. So that's not just exploration, which you are dealing with now, but that is the whole petroleum process, including the bit where you produce and make the money, up to the bit where you remove the platform and shut down the wells, and where Repsol goes home, or away. Then I will talk a little bit about climate change and what the numbers are that we need to take into account with climate change, and that has to do with the timing and the impact. And it will also illustrate why it's been so difficult to get the understanding of climate change through to people. And then finally, I'll put those 2 together on the timeline, and I hope that by that time you'll see that there's a link between the risks of a project like Repsol's project offshore here and the risks that climate change creates by the timeline that we need to act. So first, the petroleum development process. We start off with exploration. That's the stage. We're now in the last stage of exploration. So there's already a few things that have gone on. Total period of time, I put here 1 year, but the real active period is about 1 year. Usually exploration projects take a long time because it's easier to pay for a few geologists than it is to pay for a drill ship. Once the results of the exploration are in, so that will be sometime early next year, then the next stage is you take those results and you turn that into a field development plan. That's a real complete plan. At that point you calculate and you say, okay, well, is it economical? Is it not economical? If it's economical, you go to the next stage, which is the design. The front-end engineering design, the FEED stage we call it. It takes about 1 or 2 years normally. That results in complete design of the whole platform, wells, pipelines, tanker loading stations, everything. Then you start construction, so you build the stuff on the drawing, and then comes the phase of production, and that is where the money comes in instead of going out. After that is the abandonment phase, so that's when you've produced whatever you found, oil or gas. You abandon. That doesn't mean you run away, that means you actually shut down the wells and you remove the platform and the pipelines and the structures and stuff like that. That's a phase which is often not fully considered in petroleum projects from the petroleum side because it is so far away. It's 35 years away, 30 years away, 40 years away sometimes. And the way we, as economists do, the way we look at money, if we need to spend €1 million today, that is €1 million. But if we need to spend €1 million in 10 years, today that has a value of a lot less than €1 million. If we spend €1 million in 30 years, that is almost no value today. Of course, if you live 30 years from now, it's a lot of money, but that's the way economists think. And then there's the post-abandonment phase, and I put a nominal number here for 10,000 because 10,000 is a number that's already too big for engineers to work with. But the post-abandonment phase is after everything is gone, there is still a small remaining risk. And we'll come to that too. The post-abandonment phase is never taken into account in oil projects. And the reason I come across it is because I also work in CO2 storage, and for coal plants, and CO2 storage has a longer timeline. This is a typical petroleum plan. You don't have to look at the detail. It's it's a Falkland offshore project. It's very similar in scale to what Repsol is looking at here now. And as you can see, the phases, they stop at operate. That's production. And that is where the money comes back. This is all public domain. This is all in the financial sectors. This is a field I worked on this last year. I'm just going to quickly run through the timeline of what I was just explaining. So we start off, there's a few lines to look at here. The green line is an impression, it's my personal view of what the risk is to the environment, to the islands, to things that can go wrong. The blue line is the cash flow. So when the blue line goes down, then that's spending money, so Repsol is investing money. And when it goes up, then the money is coming back. And the red line, that's the net present value cash flow, which is what I said earlier about the economists taking money for today as more valuable than money in the future. When you add that up, that is the benefit to Repsol. So these are the same phases. So this is the exploration phase. Has a risk because there's drilling involved. The next two stages are the study phases. Nothing really happens here. The study happens somewhere else. So very little risk, very little cost as well. And then we go to the construction phase. The construction phase, the first part of the construction phase is only construction, and then there's a part which is construction and drilling. And then after that it goes to production and drilling, and after that to production. So you can see that here the risk goes up, and then when drilling comes in, the risk gets higher, and then drilling stops, and you have a production phase. And then at the end, when everything's finished, you have to clean up the wells, you have to remove them, you have to block them, and remove the platform. And that means that you're basically doing something similar to the drilling phase again, but this time you're doing it with really old wells, because it's steel and doesn't stay in the same condition over 30 or 40 years. So that's why the risk goes up in the abandonment. Now if we look at the cost, a lot of the investment is here. The installation, that is the big upfront cost. We'll come to that. And then once you start production, then money starts coming in. And as soon as you stop drilling, more money comes in. And then over time, over the production life of the field, the amount of oil you produce, so the amount of money you get in, gets smaller and smaller over time. And because everything gets older, the maintenance costs and the operating costs get bigger and bigger and bigger. And at some point, they reach each other, which is the zero line here. And around that point of time, you tend to say, okay, that's it. We're going to start abandoning now. Now you notice that the abandonment brings negative cash flow again. So when everything is finished and you've got the money in your pocket, you still have to spend the money on the abandonment. And this is a normal abandonment estimate, cost estimate that I've used for the last 24 years. This is where Repsol makes its profit, right? So from about 15 years to about 25 years. And this, I was talking to a petroleum economist, who was a chap who teaches petroleum economy to petroleum economists, who gives the master classes. And we were talking about abandonment costs in the North Sea, because we've always been moving the abandonment cost forward, and every time we get a little bit more out, we say, okay, we're not going to abandon this year, but we'll abandon 5 years from now. And the current estimate for the abandonment cost is many times greater than the abandonment cost that we've always assumed. And that's mainly because now we're finding out. Because we haven't built, most of these platforms are between 20 and 40 years old, so we haven't abandoned any of them. So that is something to consider. This is something which Repsol will not take into their economical calculations yet, but they should. Okay, exploration. My apologies for the title falling off. That's the first phase. So we've done the basic basin studies, seismic. Now we're about to start the drilling. That's going to start sometime this month. 3 wells. If the first well is not successful, then it's only 1 well. If the first well is successful, then there'll be 2. If the second one is also successful, then there might be 3. And then after that, depending on the schedule that Repsol is going to do, there's testing going on, which is just after you drill the well, you do, it's in the bottom picture over there, you try to produce whatever it is and you set fire to it. This is actually quite a clean one because this is a gas flare, but Repsol won't be testing gas because they won't be able to do anything with gas. The probability of success is, well, 19 or 33%, depends on who you believe. What Repsol tells the stock market is 19%. What they told the stock market 4 months ago was 17%. What they tell the newspapers is 33%. That doesn't really matter. I think I'll leave it at that, yeah. So, some of the exploration, I put down some of the benefits. The 15% of 350 million. The 350 million is the cost for 3 wells. So that's a successful exploration campaign. That's the whole thing to the end. Repsol says that 15% of that 350 million will affect the Canaries. That is the money that I explained earlier that comes through the Canaries, because it's a drilling vessel. It's run by people who work and live on that drilling vessel. The money for the drilling vessel doesn't come to the Canaries. The drilling vessel comes here to get diesel, and then it goes away. And it needs a storage space, which we'll probably see later. So all it is a transfer of equipment that comes from somewhere else, goes to the Canaries, and then goes to the drilling rig. And then waste that comes from the drilling rig goes to the Canaries and goes somewhere else again. So that 15% will go through the Canaries, but I would personally expect that almost nothing of that comes here, apart from someone with a forklift truck on a storage space here. The risks, the biggest risk, which is the known risk that everybody talks about, is the blowout. What happens if something goes wrong and the whole thing blows up? Repsol states the risk of that for them, for this well, is 1 in 50,000, 0.002%. If I look at Repsol's own record, they had 3 blowouts in the last 8 years. I don't know exactly how many wells they drilled, but my estimate would be maybe 100 in those 8 years. Maybe 1,000, doesn't really matter. If they drilled 1,000 wells, then 3 is still, 3 in 1,000, that's still 3 times the industry average, because the industry average for this type of well, the industry average for blowouts per well is 0.1%. 1 in 1,000 wells blows out. And that's all public domain information. That's a database, industry database, which you can just Google. From my personal experience, I know that Repsol is technically not of the quality that a lot of the other companies are that I work with. So from my estimate, and I spoke to a few colleagues over the last weeks about that who work and have worked with Repsol as well, the risk for working with Repsol would be substantially higher than for working with, for example, BP or Shell. There's another risk if you have a blowout. Sometimes blowouts are explosions, sometimes they get controlled. You can also get a spill. Yeah? And what we saw with Macondo, that was a blowout with a spill that follows. What has happened is, which to me is a new experience, what I've seen is that the government appears to have limited Repsol's risk to $60 million or euros, I'm not sure which. There's 20 million bond, as in they put 20 million in the bank of the government, and there's $40 million of insurance. Now, $60 million, in my view, is nothing. I mean, the uncertainty in the cost of one well for Repsol is about $50 million. Their well will cost anywhere between 60 and 140 million, depending on whether it goes well or it doesn't go very well. So the uncertainty in their well cost for one well is about that. But if you take what is a spill, if you take there's a good example, which is the Frade field in Brazil, similar water depth to what you have here, similar reservoir depth under the seafloor, what you have here, and they both determine the risk. They had a little operational mistake. I'm not going to go into the detail, but if you're interested, I can explain that later. They spilled 4,600 barrels, which is not very much. Yeah, they were lucky. Flow stopped. 4,600 barrels. The initial fine, and that fine was because Chevron, who ran that field, said, oh, well, it's only 2,000 barrels for the first day or so, and then they found out later that it was more than 2.5 times as much. Their fine was $150 million, which Chevron paid immediately. Right? And that's for a very small spill. That is what a blowout here would produce in a few hours. There's a lawsuit still going on between the Brazilian government and Chevron about this 4,600 barrel spill, with a maximum cost of $17 billion. That is the starting point for the lawsuit. So the proportion, the 60 million spill risk that the Spanish government is setting is the way I look at it is you can't take it seriously. It has absolutely nothing to do with what the risk is. Because the risk for a well is, the Frada field is a good example. There's only one well, only one fracture, one accident. Okay, so that's exploration, and those were the drilling risks, so I won't cover them again. The next stage is field development planning, and if that goes well, the front-end engineering design. So field development planning, the answer of that is it economical, is it not economical? And that also comes up with pretty pictures like this, which says, okay, well, this is the installation, this is an installation in, this is the plan for an installation north of the Falklands of Argentina. I'll use this reference more. This is a project I worked on earlier this year as well, to give you an idea. It's similar type of project, and you'll see why I use that. No particular risk to that. Now we come to construction. So everything successful, decided that this is the great thing to do. And remember, when you start with exploration, the intention is to go all the way through to construction and production. Construction is expensive business. $7 billion, Euro suggest, and that's a figure which I would state for this type of platform as well. And I've used the construction leaflets from Premier Oil. This is that Malvinas, the Falkland Island project. And you can see where a lot of the money goes. Yeah, this is the platform construction that gets constructed by specialists anywhere around the world. It doesn't matter. The platform gets built by platform builders. Canaries doesn't have platform builders, so and neither does the Falklands. So topsides get built somewhere. Far East, USA has topside builders. Middle East has topside builders, and the structure, Korea, Singapore, Japan. A lot of GDP. This is Repsol's quote again. They say 1.3 billion of that total amount will be added to the GDP. That is the same thing that I mentioned earlier with the money passing through. And I put the picture again. This is the Falkland Islands project, similar scale project, also the first platform in the basin. This is the onshore supply base. That is, and if you want the detail, you can find this on the web. You can look through the detail. This actually specifies how many people will be working at which stage of the project where. The money, the 1.3 billion, most of it is stuff that comes in from another country, gets stored wherever they can get to your supply base, and then leaves again. So the amount of money that actually stays in the Canaries of the 1.3 billion is, I would say, not very much. The third point that Repsol makes is that they, to get people enthusiastic, is that they will build a hub in the Canaries. And the hub is like a harbor with the center, with the storage space and everything else. Now, if an oil company comes in and has one project, in one field and one platform, and they want to build a hub, then the reason they want to build a hub is because they want the government to pay. Because if there's only one project, and we say, okay, well, we need a harbor, but there's only one project, then the government, of course, says, well, Repsol, you pay the harbor. You need it, you build it. But when they come and they say, well, we need a hub because you're going to have lots of other projects in the area, and they're all going to come to the Canaries to build and to store their stuff, then the government will be tempted to finance the infrastructure that Repsol needs. That's the background to it. From what I know about the area, this is not a place for a hub. It's from the results of the Moroccan coast, a lot of that is too small. You might get one or two developments in the area, but whether they'll come this way, it's too far for a lot of them. It's probably not politically stable. So, the benefits of the construction phase are mainly that there'll be some onshore construction infrastructure, and obviously if Repsol finances the infrastructure for one project, then the Canaries will still have the infrastructure, and there'll be a little bit of storage and logistics going on. The risks are mainly onshore land use. There'll be drilling going on, so the same risks that we saw earlier. Seabed construction, pipeline laying, not really big risks. Okay, the drilling phase starts somewhere in there. What I said earlier, the benefits. Now you see it, there'll be more shipping going on because the more drilling goes on, the more supply you need back and forth. and there'll be some storage and logistics like the supply base that I showed you earlier. The actual drilling jobs are external jobs. They are experts, people experienced in that area, and they will come in, they will work here typically 28 days, and then they'll fly back home for the next 28 days. The risks, I mentioned the blowouts, leaks, spills, and then in addition you'll have submarine noise, and as you have an increase in shipping, that also brings an additional risk of shipping collisions and small spills from the shipping. Okay, the next stage is production. Just very quick, what is production? We take whatever comes out of a well, or for a project is whatever comes out of 10 or 20 or maybe 30 wells. We put that in a big tank, we inject some chemicals. It's a very simplified version, right, for a €7 billion plant. Inject some chemicals to be able to separate the oil and to make sure that it doesn't plug up the formation. And then 3 things come out at the end. One of them is gas, because oil has gas dissolved in it, so there will be some amount of gas. You try to use the gas that you have to run your compressors and generators. If you don't have enough, then you use diesel to fill it, and if you have too much, then you burn it, you flare it. Depending on the location, you can also export it, but to export gas, to be able to sell it, you need a pipeline. And the distance from shore to here is unlikely to sustain a pipeline, and the amount of gas that you need in Fuerteventura or Lanzarote is unlikely to sustain that too. So that will be flared. The oil goes out to whatever the export route is, which is probably either a pipeline to shore or a tanker. Let's say most likely a tanker. And the water goes into the sea. Now the water contains most of the chemicals that we injected at the beginning, the process chemicals, because most of those chemicals are water phase. So they will also go into the sea. And another thing that goes into the sea is a very small amount of oil. And the legal limits in the UK for this amount of oil are 30 parts per million, with excursions up to 100 parts per million. There's no technical reason why you have to put that much oil, why that much oil has to stay in the water. You can clean the oil to 1 or 2 parts per million relatively easily, but it's a bigger investment. But the law says 30 parts per million in the UK. What that means, over the life of the platform, you start off producing mostly oil. Towards the end of the life of the platform, you'll be producing very little bit of oil and mostly water. So for a 120,000 barrel a day platform, by the end of the life you're producing 120,000 barrels a day of water with 30 ppm of oil in it. So every day of the production life of your field, which is 10 to 20 years, you'll be dumping 3 to 7 barrels of oil into the sea. It's diluted, so you don't see it much. Whether that's damaging in some circumstances, that's anybody's guess. But you have to understand that if you produce, you automatically spill oil into the sea by design. Okay, so this is the stage that's interesting for Repsol. They say that's great for the Canaries because 5.2 billion in OPEX. OPEX is the expense for actually running the platform. If I take that 5.2 billion and I subtract the typical well repair cost, I subtract the typical operational chemical cost, then the rest is what they spend in maintenance and generator support and diesel and what have you. If I assume that all of that stuff is really useful for the Canaries, it's still only 0.3% of the GDP of the Canaries. 0.3%. More than 33% of the Canaries' GDP is tourism. So if you lose 1% of your tourists by this whole game, then it's already not viable. And this doesn't start, of course, until 15 years later, 15 years after today. So the money, I think, is not as much as it looks. The other point that Repsol makes very clearly is there'll be a lot of jobs, 3,000 to 5,000 jobs, and when I first saw that number, I always have 2 questions when people talk about jobs. The first one is, are they parallel or are they sequential? And the reason for that is that it's very easy to get a lot of jobs sequential because you need someone to sweep the floor, so you get someone in, sweeps the floor, goes home. That's one job, right? You get someone in the next day, needs to sweep the floor again, 2 jobs. If jobs are sequential, it means absolutely nothing. So that's an important question to ask of Repsol whenever they mention jobs. The other point is, I said, what? How many for a project like this? And this is the reason why. This is another field I worked on earlier this year, on a field that was going to tie into this. Very similar scale, same amount of oil production, except that this is a triple platform instead of a single floating unit. Initial investment, and this is what is published online and in the papers in Aberdeen, right, where we know what oil brings in jobs. And they come up with, if you read the whole article, with 100 offshore jobs and 20 onshore jobs. And of those offshore jobs, I can tell you now, the offshore jobs, about half of them are technical specialist jobs, so they will come from somewhere else. And then there'll be, maintenance, painting, catering, that kind of stuff, which will come from wherever is cheapest. And the onshore jobs are the logistics jobs. So there will be base managers and things like that, which will come from elsewhere because they will be run by the international supply companies. And then what is left over is the jobs. Now, I haven't read this article completely, but this is the numbers of an operating group, and there's more examples of this. The big point to make here is that it's worth questioning the numbers because they are so wildly off what my experience is that I have no idea where they get them from. And then the final point that Repsol made, I've actually seen different points made. One of them is energy security for Spain, and the other one was affordable energy for Spain. And there's only one problem with that, is that the energy security makes no difference because it's all an oil market. So whether the oil gets produced here and put in a tanker here, or whether it gets produced in Venezuela and put in a tanker in Venezuela, makes absolutely no difference. The oil ends up on the world market. Spain has to go to the world market to buy it. Makes no difference which country it comes from. With gas, it's different, right? With gas, you have a pipeline, and the pipeline is in a country. So that automatically creates a certain amount of energy security because the country has the valve. But with oil, it's a completely different world. And the same thing for the comment about the affordable energy for Spain. If you want affordable energy, then I think there are better ways of doing that. Good, so this is the summary of what I already said, I think, most of. So the important thing is, don't overestimate the jobs, and remember that there is pollution involved with production no matter how good you do. The last stage, I'll try to cut this a little bit short, the abandonment. What you do after everything's ready, after you produce the oil and it doesn't make any money anymore, is we plug the wells with cement, because it's the only thing we have. And then we remove as much of the steel pipework as we can, we remove the platform, and we bring that somewhere. And that'll probably be somewhere here. So we'll leave a lot of steel scrap, which is free for you to sell to wherever they want a lot of steel scrap. It's a critical operation, and it's not easy to do well. With all other operations, you do a job and then you can check whether it worked, and you do a job and you check whether it worked, and that's the essence of engineering. With the abandonment, it's the only time when you actually set these plugs in the well, but you cannot test them, because you cannot go below the plug to find out, because that's where the empty reservoir is. So you hope it works. The only check you have is that you did the job properly in the first place. And that is a potential risk. Wells pretty much never get inspected after abandonment. There are a few examples where we looked at the wells, and I mentioned here the US land and Norway. The percentages of leaking wells are difficult to find, but it's going to be lower than the 30% that was in the US onshore area, because a lot of those were older. The Norway, whether that's about 2% or 1%, is that order of magnitude. So this is the percentage of wells that have been abandoned, so there's nothing there anymore, that are still leaking something. So the benefits. The benefits of the abandonment phase for Repsol are the transfer of responsibility, because when Repsol starts, they take on the responsibility for anything that happens, And once the government has approved the abandonment paperwork, then the responsibility goes back to the government. So if anything goes wrong after that, it's the government's job. And the other benefit is, well, if you're a steel trader, then you'll probably get a lot of scrap to deal with at the end. There are some risks involved, and they have to do with the economics. Yeah, because the abandonment is when the oil companies have already made the money. So the only thing they have left is expenditure. They don't need the infrastructure, they don't need anything else. They basically want to get out as cheaply and as quickly as possible. And that is a risk anywhere, but you'll see later that that risk is bigger with the whole climate change impact here. Because my last question, what if the operator is already bankrupt, is a real one, because this is expenditure, yeah? So this is a lot of money to spend to put something right, because if you just leave it there, then it will leak. If the operator is already bankrupt, if you take the Macondo example, yeah, the blowouts in the Gulf of Mexico, that got pretty close to bankrupting BP. BP is 4 times as big as Repsol. So a blowout like that would have bankrupted Repsol. If Repsol would have a blowout anywhere in the world, doesn't have to be here, it could be anywhere in the world of that scale, they would be bankrupt. If Repsol is bankrupt, then at this point in time there will be an installation offshore here which has almost no value because there's almost no oil left, but will take a lot of money to fix so that it doesn't do any damage. And that is a real risk, and that's part of where the climate change comes in, because it's a risk that has never been looked at, not in my experience in the oil industry, because oil industry always goes on. So you abandon some fields and you develop some new fields and there'll be new cash flows coming in. It's never been an issue. But what we'll see in a minute, that could well become an issue. And then the post-abandonment phase, so this is after the abandonment is approved by the government, there are still things that might happen, but there are very few people who will be able to do something about it. To summarize this, the important thing is to decide, oil is often called black gold, but the black part of it and the gold part of it don't end up in the same hands. And it's worth questioning which hands black is coming into and which hands the gold is coming into. And I think you'll find that the gold tends to end up with the oil companies and the people who work for the oil companies and the shareholders of the oil companies, and most of the black stuff ends up with the countries where the oil is found. I'll skip that. I'll quickly, abruptly move on to climate change because I'm a little bit short on time. Okay. On climate change. Completely different subject, but you'll see it has a lot to do with what we were just talking about. Climate change seems to be not that exciting for a lot of people. And that's not really surprising because climate change is a very, very slow process. And people are not very good at remembering things. Not things that go back farther than their own generation. I don't know if you've heard of the anecdote of the frog. This is 18th century research. If you put a frog in a tub of hot water, then it jumps out. Right? If you put a frog in a tub of cold water and then you very, very slowly warm up the water, then by the time the frog feels that it's too hot, it's already cooked. It actually dies while you heat up the water. And people are a little bit like that. I think I'm going to skip the fish. On the climate change, the climate process of change is very slow. And it makes it difficult to catch. Now the good thing is we have a thing called writing, and we have a thing called science. And with science we can investigate stuff, and then with writing we can record that for the future. So we can actually solve the problem of our memory. We can actually find out what the changes have been over a longer period of time. It's just that we're finding it very difficult to do that. But that stuff is available. Now, the climate change issue that people focus on is the warming. Yeah? 1 or 2 degrees warmer, and if it gets more, then it gets out of hand. That getting out of hand bit, that's the important bit of climate change. The 1 or 2 degrees, that's not really the issue. The issue is that those 1 or 2 degrees change have the potential of creating really big consequences that are the problem. And I'll mention 3 here, the 3 most obvious ones, but there are lots more. The ice cap melt, and it's something that will take away the self-controlled climate mechanism. If things warm a little bit, you get a little bit less ice, and this goes for the mountains as well as the polar caps. A little bit less ice, you get a little bit less heat reflection into the stratosphere or into space, and that makes it a little bit warmer again. And as it gets a little bit warmer, you melt a little bit more ice, you reflect a little bit less heat, and once this cycle starts, the only thing that stops it is running out of ice, because it's a positive feedback loop, so it accelerates itself. A similar process happens with the tundra, large areas of land which are frozen, and the tundra contains methane, which is a warming gas, but when the tundra thaws, it also creates methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas much stronger than CO2, and whether it's 40 times or 80 times, it depends on how you look at the time scales. Same thing happens. You get a little bit of tundra melt, you get a little bit of methane in the atmosphere, that warms everything up a little bit, you get a little bit more tundra melt, you get a little bit more methane, and before you know it, your tundra is melted and the methane is in the atmosphere. Once these things start, you can't stop them. And the 2 degrees is the point where at least most of the climate scientists around, and we're talking, most is 98%, think that you definitely don't want to exceed that. Yeah. It's not that I think it's safe, I think that it's definitely unsafe if you go beyond that. So what causes climate change? The 2 main factors, one of them is the smaller one, is chopping down trees without replanting them. Deforestation. That's between 10 and 20% of the total CO2 emissions that we're looking at. But by far the biggest one is burning oil, gas, and coal. And the common reaction still is, well, but we can't live without that. Yeah, we can't live without our ships and our trucks and our planes. And and the problem is not that. That's not the question. This is the question. We cannot live with these things anymore. Because if we do, then there will be a lot of things not left for us to live with. And to explain what that risk is, and to explain some of the issues, and also to explain why it's so difficult to get the climate change message, to get people to understand that, especially our governments. I'm going to use an approach which was started by Bill McKibben, who is the founder of an organization called 350.org. You might have heard of if you've read something about climate change. The first number that is important in this is the 2 degrees. I've mentioned that before. 2 degrees is the maximum warming from pre-industrial time, so that's say 1800, that everybody agrees we must stay under. And when I say everybody, that includes pretty much all the governments. That includes China, includes Russia, it includes the EU, it even includes the US. They've all agreed to this. 2 degrees is something we should not go above. Now the next number, the 565 gigatons, which is 565 billion tons, is the amount of carbon that we can emit into the atmosphere and still probably stay below the 2 degrees Celsius. So that's pretty much the carbon budget that we should not exceed. Now, if you take our current emissions and our current growth rate in emissions, getting to that point will take us 15 years. And that is not very far away. What that means is that if we want to do what we all agree that we should do, which is stay below the 2 degrees Celsius, then we better make up our mind quickly. Because if we continue to do what we're doing now with burning our fossil fuels, we will exceed that point in 15 years. Now, what makes it so difficult to get this message across is this number. 2,795 gigatons. That is the carbon content of the current proven oil, gas and coal reserves in the world. So that is what all the oil and gas and coal companies together already have without exploration or anything. It's what they already have. And what these two numbers mean is that 80% of what the oil companies and the coal companies already have has to stay into the ground if we want to get to the point that we all agree we should, which is less than 2 degrees change. And that big difference between what we already have and how much we can burn basically means that a lot of the value of the oil companies, a lot of the share value, a lot of the value that they're traded on, that is based on their reserves. So 80% of that value isn't there. And there is a small but growing awareness of that now. And one of the clear messages was that a month ago, Mark Carney, who's the governor of the Bank of England, warned the financial world in London that they should take that into account because that their oil shares are going to collapse. And to be honest, if the governor of the Bank of England says that, then I hope he gets listened to at some point, but that is someone who understands what these risks are. But that's the reason, the urgency together with the difficulty and the amount of stuff we already have, why Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, basically included a climate summit in the New York UN conference in September. It's why 750,000 people were out on the streets, including a handful here in Las Palmas on the 21st of September. But it's especially why carbon companies should not be involved in determining the future energy policy, because they don't know anything about the future energy. In fact, they shouldn't really be involved in influencing anything to do with the future, because that's not where they operate. Now, the good thing about the whole story is that for 95% of the solutions, they already exist, they are proven, and they are economical. And in the economical game, you can say, oh, but I thought they were more expensive than oil or more expensive than gas or whatever else. There are lots of ways of calculating whether it's economical. Don't underestimate what the oil price is going to do if that changes, what that does with whether you can get oil at all. There's a lot of things that are economical now which might not be. So 95% of the solution is there. All we need to do is get the political will to actually start using it. And the remaining 5% of solutions, we've got 15 years to work them out. And that's a challenge, but that's not an impossible amount. Now, I made a list here of some things, because the questions I often get is, well, it's not possible and it won't work and everything else. There's a number of organizations who already have complete plans on what we need to do in order to get there. And one of those organizations, the first one on the list, is the International Energy Agency. That is an oil industry, or originally an oil industry group. And the reason I'm aware of their oil background is because they had a big conflict with a number of energy suppliers who were in the green energy, because their forecasts for green energy were so bad that they couldn't be used by the energy industry anymore. They've changed. They now actually have two forecasts. They have one if we keep on doing what we do now, and they have another forecast which says, well, if we decide to take climate change seriously, this might happen. It's a tentative guess, but they also have a lot of reports and studies, and all publicly available, on how to do that. Just like for, what is it, Greenpeace has a quite extensive document for Spain for converting the whole, I haven't read it, I have to say, it was 740 pages or something. There's a lot available. The difficulty is not how to do it. The difficulty is in deciding to do it. So you've seen the 15 years from the climate change. This is the same plot that I used earlier, but I added a few lines. And the green line, the first, that is roughly, on the same time scale, roughly the oil demand that the oil industry assumes will happen, and that's based on the IEA forecast. I didn't add numbers on it, but it's a rising demand. Now, if we altogether decide to do something about climate change, we decide that we really think that this 2 degrees is a good idea to stick to, then the demand is more likely to look like that. Yeah, then by 2050 or 2080, the demand will be pretty close to zero, and whether that's zero or whether that's 30%, that's not even necessary for the debate. But what you'll see is that these forecasts are diverging just where Repsol starts making the money. And normally, and there's a lot of ups and downs in this as well, normally if the demand goes down, but the supply stays up, then the price goes down. And the price is already dropping now, as you've probably seen, because the oil price a few months back was over $100, and now it was 83 a few days back. The economic cutoff for a project like Repsol is doing, without knowing anything further but just comparing it with typical cutoffs for other projects around the world, is between $75 and actually $95 per barrel. If the oil price is below that, then they will not get their money back. And the oil price now is actually just on 85. That whole conflict is going to happen just when these guys need to make their money. So there's two questions that must be asked, and they must be asked by the government before you decide to go this way. One of them is, if the oil price does indeed go down, there's a serious risk that the oil price can change anyway. Will Repsol be able to finance the abandonment? Will they, in 35 years, have, 7 or 8 billion euros in their bank account still, and the technology to get rid of the stuff that they planted offshore here? And the other thing is, in the period before, will Repsol be able to make any money? Because if Repsol doesn't make any money, then the Spanish government is unlikely to make any money too. Depends a little bit on the type of agreement that you have, whether it's a royalty agreement or tax agreements or how that goes. There are lots of different ways of looking at it. But typically the government starts getting money when the oil company starts making profit. If Repsol doesn't make a profit, then the Spanish government doesn't make a profit. And if then you need to abandon, and Repsol is bankrupt, which is a substantial risk in my view, then where's the money going to come from? Because it's not going to come from this oil project if you haven't made it. But this is only one scenario. Yeah? This is not black and white. There's a lot of uncertainties in all this stuff. But the timeline is important, because the climate change timeline is about the same as the time from now to when this project is supposed to be paying back the money. So in summary on the project, I just highlighted a few points. In my view, this project has a high environmental risk. There are a few risks which I haven't even touched on. Okay, I talked to a geomechanical specialist, colleague of mine, yesterday about the seismic risk, about the risk of earthquakes. And yes, that has a risk for the exploration drilling, but that has a substantial risk for the whole production phase, and will also have a risk for the abandonment and the post-abandonment phase. In addition to the risk you already have with deep water, with the first well, which is shallow, with the last well, which is extra deep, they have their own special categories of risk. I think there's a higher economical risk to the Canaries, because I think the oil price fluctuations are substantial. I think the economics, the risks of getting a negative impact on your current economy are substantial. I think the likelihood of getting a positive impact on your current economy are very small. And I think that summarizes it. So, consideration, to come back to the black gold, is to really think about who ends up with the black and who ends up with the gold. Thank you.
¿Alguna preguntita que hacer, chicos?
Well, I want to know one thing. You are showing two ways that it will go in the time. Sorry about my English, first of all. And if with the climatic change, if all the governments say, okay, there's a problem, and they take cards in to solve it,
Yeah.
it shows that it will be a decrease on the oil demand.
Yeah.
So Repsol will have no money to solve the abandoned part,
Yeah.
and we probably will have to pay and try to the Spain government will
Yeah.
have to pay, and will be not any benefit about this. And the other
That's correct.
the other way is that government say, okay, no, we don't do anything. Okay, the oil demand will be okay, but the world will be out with the climatic change.
Yeah.
So at the end, any way to do this project will be a bad decision, is what I said.
That's the way I see it, yeah.
And
That's the way I see it, because there's one, it doesn't have to be the Spanish government who decides to do something about the climate change thing, right? If the Chinese and the Russian government, or the Chinese and the Indian government, or the US government and some other government decide to do something about that, that will have such an impact on the oil demand that will have a consequence for the price. So if a number of countries decide that it's serious, then the demand will go down. And it might not go down as far as you would hope, but it will go down, and at some point things will not go well. Yeah.
So, what I say is this part of thinking have been taken care by the Spanish government to know that that will be not a good idea to, because here in Canary Island, in part, most people I think have and not all the information, but part of the information to say, okay, that's not a good idea. But it seems that from the government in Spain, they say only thing is a good idea, when all shows that it's not true.
Well, it depends on where you are and who you are. And if you go back, you might be able to see that on this graph. You can see the lines that are underlying here, right? Because this is the net cash flow. Yeah, Repsol spending money. One of the things Repsol is spending money on is the salaries of the CEOs of Repsol. Yeah? So, for the people involved, I mean, if I were to work on this project, I would get paid here. Yeah? So, for some people, yeah, it's a good idea. And as long as you retire before there. And I think that's the consideration. But to be honest, the whole link between the climate change timeline and production and development timelines, that's one of the reasons why I set up this organization a few months back, is because nobody's looking at that. And the reason I was talking to this petroleum economist last week is to get him to include it in his master classes, petroleum economy. And what we want to try to do is to get that published at a petroleum conference, because it is a critical issue. The problem with it is that if you assume that that's correct, that 80% of the value of the oil companies is fiction, yeah, that exploration is useless because we already have the oil, then what's going to happen next? How are you going to decide which companies end up with zero value and which companies end up with maybe even 100% of their value? Is that going to be decided by operating cost? Is it going to be decided by geopolitical, area of production? There's lots of scenarios, but it's always pretty dark for the oil industry. And the difficulty with that is that the people in the oil industry, they will adapt. That's not the problem. The reason that I actually got together and picked this up and I can still find work, right, is because the other people, my colleagues, are also concerned about lots of other things. But there are people in charge of these companies who are more linked to the financial circles. And there, of course, it's a disaster. Because if you have a share now and you know that at some point in time it's going to lose most of its value, it's surprising that people still trade these shares, because even if there's a small risk that this would happen, then you say, well, I wouldn't buy shares. I wouldn't buy shares of a company if I knew that there was a risk that it would lose all its value in 5 years, 10 years. And the one thing which I didn't illustrate here is that oil price fluctuations we see, and I've screened projects over the last 25 years with oil prices as low as $10 a barrel, where you couldn't make a project work if the oil price, you had to make it work at an oil price of $10 a barrel. And I've screened projects recently where the cutoff is $95 a barrel. So they lose money if it's less than 95. I've seen the forecasts do everything. Those changes in oil price, there's a lot of impacts on them, right? But the biggest driver of the change in oil price is the difference between supply and demand. And it's tiny. It's a tiny difference. You can find these numbers on the Society of Petroleum Engineers website. They publish them every 2 months or so. Very small difference that makes it suddenly go up and suddenly go down. And that uncertainty in itself is still there, and that's ignored as well by the petroleum companies. I mean, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, makes oil price forecasts, and their forecast is a low of $60 and a high of $200. And how they get this low of $60, I don't know, because 10, 15 years ago it was lower than that. But $60, a lot of oil and gas projects are just about economically viable at $60. So my feeling is that they decide on the $60 because that's convenient, because they don't actually do any political scenarios. All they do is they take what happened before, and they say, okay, well, if that happened for the last few years, then this is going to happen from now. And that's another big risk. But getting the Spanish government to see this, and then seeing if they can, let's put it this way, Repsol also makes windmills, right? Repsol also does renewables. And investing the same 10 billion euros, if you want energy security in Spain, then you don't invest in something that you've got 5 or 10 years of some money from, and that's it. If you invest the same amount in whatever form of renewable, then you build energy security because you create your own energy.
Yeah, that's
the whole concept is different.
the problem is that here in Spain we have already grow in renewable energy and the government just shut it down.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I think that it's something necessary to share this kind of information because it's, I think, the only way to keep companies as Repsol out of the decisions
Mm-hmm.
in the government. So I think that we have to share this information so people can think and decide what is true and what is Repsol is lying, so we can know the real information. And then I have 2 questions. First one is this graph you have there. How do you measure the risks? I mean, you have there some numbers, and you say the risk increase or decrease, but how do you get these numbers? And
Yeah,
well,
okay.
that's
No? I just make a measure of the risks for myself. This is my own estimate of the risks. And I specifically looked at what I consider technical risks with an environmental impact. So failures, things that go wrong, which will cause a spill or damage or something like that.
so it's an economic.
But it's
cost.
it's my, well, the risk, I see the risk as an environmental risk in this case. So it's the risk of a spill that causes damage. It's, when you look at risks in this context, it's a little bit difficult to quantify that exactly, because when you want to really calculate the risk, I can do you a calculation, not now, but it'll take me a while. Yeah. You can do a calculation of what the risk is of a blowout, what the mitigations are, the things you can do to reduce that risk, and what the possible consequences are of that risk as well. And a lot of that is done at some point in the field development planning. But that depends on the boundary conditions. Yeah? If you say, well, look, it's the middle of the ocean somewhere, and by the time that it hits the shore, it'll already be dispersed or evaporated or something like that. If you put that into your risk calculation, your risk goes down. And to me, that doesn't necessarily make the risk smaller. Just because people see it doesn't make the risk smaller for me. Yeah. It's good that people see it. Yeah. I mean, the reason that the Macondo disaster, in my view, I mean, it was a disaster, but that it was really a good place to have it is because you don't have many blowouts where you have television cameras. Especially Americans, because they're really good at complaining as long as it's in their backyard. And that's what Macondo did. If that hadn't been there, I mean, there are blowouts all over the world continuously. Or maybe not continuously, but quite a few every year, between 5 and 10 every year. But you don't see them, you don't hear them. So, but the risk is my estimate of the risk, and a lot of the risk is related to drilling, but the production phase has substantial risk as well. And that was before I spoke to my friend the geomechanics specialist, about the earthquake risk. And that would, in my view, probably make the production risk go up. Because if you get an earthquake that damages your wells, then when you're producing, it'll damage 20 or 30 wells at the same time. And if you get earthquake damage, then you have a reasonable chance that you won't be able to fix your well. So but it's a difficult issue. There's lots of input parameters into it, and it's the same with the oil price forecast. I can't say that the price will go down because there are lots of parameters that play a role in that. If the oil price goes down, say, to $50 a barrel for 10 years, then quite a lot of the oil companies and the oil producers will be broke. So then maybe, you have only a few companies left, then maybe the oil price will go up again. So there's a lot of uncertainties there, but it will change. It's a big uncertainty. And my bet is that it will go down.
And the other question is, you say that we have the solutions now? We have already the solutions. And how do you solve the problem in big cities? I mean, is that true? We have the solution even for big cities to get the energy that we need. That's real now?
There are solutions, and I don't want to go into too much detail of the solution because there are a lot of different views. And one of the concerns that I have with a lot of these different views is that a lot of people tend to focus on one solution. I don't think there's one solution. I think what we need to do is we need to use every solution that we have. And the other thing is that about 40% of the CO2 emissions are the direct result of wasting of energy. It's basically stuff that we don't use efficiently. Just changing the efficiency to what we can achieve, and that's in our power generation plants, but it's in our power distribution plants, it's the whole system. It's up to, obviously, northern countries insulating their homes, all that stuff. takes 40% off the CO2 emissions. Just doing that will give us an extra 10 years of time. But there's a lot of stuff that's happening, because if you take, and okay, cities require a substantial amount of power, but cities require much less power than if you use it efficiently. And to take an example of power supply, just taking, and this is just going back to when I was still living in Holland 30 years ago. Power plants in the Netherlands had an efficiency 30 years ago of between 80 and 92%. Power plants in the UK, when I first moved to the UK 25 years ago, had an efficiency of between 40 and 50%. The biggest difference was that UK power stations are on the coast, far away from wherever, because they're big and noisy and messy. Dutch power stations are in the cities. And one of the reasons they're in the cities is obviously they're clean, so they have recycling of the waste gases and all the other stuff. But it's because the waste heat is used for the heating of the houses in the city. And that is where you need it. And it's used for the heating of industrial processes. And that's where it's needed. And the CO2 emissions have been fed into the greenhouses. One of the reasons that the Dutch agriculture is quite productive is because the CO2 goes straight into the greenhouses and ends up in the tomatoes. There's a lot of those things which have been around for 30, 40 years, but they're not implemented in lots of places. And if you take that, solar panels, the price of photovoltaic panels has been going down dramatically. I saw a report 2 weeks ago where they analyzed the actual cost price of photovoltaic energy in the US for each state. And about 3/4 of the states, the cost of photovoltaic energy now is less than the cost of the electricity that they get out of the grid. That's now already the case, right? And photovoltaic is still probably the most expensive alternative energy. But there's a lot of approaches to that. I mean, one of the things that's been bugging me for quite a few years is the amount of subsidy that the oil industry gets and the coal industry. In the US, the oil and coal industry gets 10 times as much subsidy as the wind and solar energy. And worldwide, it's between 10 and 100 times as much. A lot of the subsidy, but it's all hidden subsidies. It's tax breaks here. The project that I showed you, the Calais, the Maersk project, with the 100 jobs. That project is only viable because they got a special tax break, because it's a special high pressure, high temperature field, and therefore because they can't make it pay in normal rules. And that tax break is government money. That goes to them. Yeah? And the nuclear energy, nuclear energy has a special kind of part in the whole game, and I'm happy to do the discussion for or against nuclear separately. But nuclear energy is the only energy group that gets long-term subsidy agreements. For nuclear energy, you always get 10 or 20 years agreed subsidies. If you would do that with alternative energy, take exactly the same subsidy, just don't give it to nuclear, but give it to renewables, you would get much more energy, much more efficiently, and finally all these renewable groups will be able to invest. Because the problem is that every year these rules get changed, and that's not just in Spain, that's everywhere. Change every year or every 2 years, and then it becomes successful, so we get lots of green energy, we don't need the subsidy anymore. No, they keep the subsidy for the oil and the coal, but they just take it away from the renewables. And that's the bit that has to change. And that has to change in the government. And that means that we all need to be knocking on the doors of the government. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Eric, thank you very much for coming here to talk us about the oil, ya que es un tema que es actual en Canarias y que nos incumbe a todos, la verdad. Así que muchas gracias a todos por venir y nos vemos el próximo miércoles aquí, en la sala de grado, en nuestro curso.